Hello children, Force and Laws of Motion. Class 9, Subject Science, Chapter 9, and this is the part 2. So in the previous class, we have studied about the force definition, about the state of motion and the effects of force. Yes or no children? So in today's class, let's talk about the different types of forces. Okay? So contact force and non-contact force. So what do you understand by contact and non-contact? Yes, so contact in the sense in touch with the object. Okay, so whenever any object changes its state of motion, we know it is being acted on by a force. Yes or no? If an object changes its state of motion in the sense what? Last class I have taught you, which means either it is at rest or it is moving. Okay, if it changes its state of motion, which means either from rest to motion or motion to rest, or the change in the speed happens, then what happens? We know that the force is being acted on that object. Right? So we saw examples of contact forces, that is when a man was pushing a cart. So what happens when a man is pushing a cart? He is in contact with that cart, which means he is touching the cart and then he is pushing. Right? So if there is an iron nail and you bring a magnet near it, so the nail moves and clings to the magnet, which means what? Here you are not making that iron nail to touch the magnet. Right? If you keep at some distance also, it clings to the magnet, right? So we can therefore infer that there is a force acting on the nail due to the magnet even though there is no contact, which means not only the objects will have the force effect by contact, even though if it is no contact also, which means non-contact also, there is a force that is acting on it. Okay, so the another example of non-contact force is gravitation. So the apple falling from the tree is what made Newton understand the gravitational force, right? So the next two slides present some of the major forces we encounter. So we'll look at the different types of forces in next slides. So types of forces. So we have two types, that is contact force and non-contact force. So under contact force, you have got two types, that is muscular force and frictional force. And under non-contact force, you have got three types, that is magnetic, electrostatic and gravitational force. So let's talk about that in detail. So contact force means forces experienced by bodies when they are in physical contact with each other, which means when they are physically connected, physically are in contact with each other, then such kind of forces is said to be contact force. Okay, so let's look at the non-contact force definition. So forces experienced by bodies even if they are not in physical contact with each other, which means physically they are not contact with each other, then such kind of a force is said to be non-contact force. Clear? So now let's look at the types in contact force. We have already seen in the previous slide, we have two types, that is muscular force and frictional force. So now let's talk about muscular force. So what do you understand by muscular force? Muscular means muscle force, okay, muscle power. So whichever the force due to the action of muscles is said to be muscular force, which means when you try to push a cart or when you try to push a car or whatever it is, okay, if you are using your muscle power in order to do all these actions, then such kind of a force is said to be muscular force. Understood children? So next comes the frictional force under contact force. Okay, which means what? So frictional force is nothing but the force acting opposite to the direction of motion. Okay, so which means frictional force refers to the force generated by two surfaces that are in contact. Okay children, which means what? They are affected by surface texture and the amount of force. If the surface is smooth, then what happens? Frictional force is less. If the surface is rough, then the frictional force is more, where you cannot push a table. Understood children? So always remember the frictional force is opposite to the direction of the motion. Okay? If you are moving from left to right, any object, then the frictional force is from right to left. Clear? Here it is in contact with the ground. Yes or no? So this is also one of the type of contact force. Okay. So next comes the non-contact force. Three types, that is magnetic force, electrostatic force and gravitational force. So what do you understand by magnetic force? The force exerted by a magnet. Yes, of course. Yes or no? As the name itself indicates, magnetic force means the force exerted by a magnet. It can be either the magnet and magnet or the iron nails and a magnet. So whatever that happens with respect to magnet is said to be magnetic force. Okay. So here the objects will not be in contact with each other. It will be kept little far, but still it gets attracted. So such type of a force is said to be magnetic force. Is it clear, children? So next comes the electrostatic force. Electrostatic force means the force exerted by a charged body on another charged or uncharged body is said to be electrostatic force. So in this case, the example is taken as comb. So when you comb your hair and if you bring a piece of papers near to it, so what happens? The papers gets attracted towards the comb, right? So this happens because of electrostatic force. And the third type of force is gravitational force. So attractive force exerting between any two objects is said to be gravitational force. Is it clear, children? So we have studied about the Newton. Yes. So next comes the balanced force and unbalanced force. So what do you mean by balanced force? So more than one force can act on an object at one time. So the net force is the sum of all the force vectors acting on an object. Many forces combine to make the net force. Net force in the sense it's like an average, which means the sum of all the force is nothing but net force. Clear? So the net force decides the change in state of motion. So when two or more forces cancel out each other to create a net force of 0, then such forces on the object is called balanced force. Which means, for example, say if two persons want to move a table, one from left side he is applying 5 Newton of force, and again from right side the person is also applying 5 Newton force, then they both cancel out each other, and this type of force is said to be balanced force. So whenever balanced force is there, the object will not move. It will be in equilibrium position, which means what? It will be at rest. Okay. So the forces on the object are then in equilibrium and no net force on the object. The object will not accelerate, that is, the velocity of the object will not change. Clear, children? So balanced force means the object will be at rest. Next comes the unbalanced force. Okay, so before that there is one more example here. If a number of forces are acting on a body and the body does not change its velocity vector, the forces are called balanced forces. Example, in a floating body, the weight acting downwards is balanced by the buoyancy force acting upward. Okay, so this is one of the example which you will be studying in detail in the next unit. If two or more forces acting on the same object result in a net non-zero force, it would change the state of motion. So the forces are said to be unbalanced force. So when does any object move? If any one person is applying more force than other, then the object moves. Yes or no? Which means there what happens? It is unbalanced force. The force is not balancing. Hence the object will move. Clear? So force is in one dimension. So in a tug of war, when two teams pull it with equal effort, the rope and the two teams remain stationary. If they are remaining stationary means they are at rest, then it is said to be balanced force. And when one of the team pulls the rope harder then both teams move in the direction of the greater force. So this is an example of unbalanced force. So next, friction forces and its effects. So what happens when someone tries to push a box on a rough floor? So rough floor means what? More friction. Clear? So if he pushes the box with small force, the box does not move because of the friction acting in a direction opposite to the push. Always remember, the friction force is the opposite force towards the motion. Which means if an object is moving from left to right, the frictional force is from right to left. It balances the pushing force and therefore the box does not move. So the rougher the surface, the frictional forces are higher, and so box remains stationary even for moderate levels of push. Have you all understood, children? If the surface is rough, then the frictional force is more higher. So if he pushes the box harder still, the pushing force becomes greater than the frictional force. So there is an unbalanced force in the direction of push and the box starts moving in the pushed direction, as you all can see in this diagram. So we have studied about the different types of force, that is contact and non-contact force, and we have studied the different types in contact force also, non-contact force also. Yes or no, children? And about balanced and unbalanced force. So this is the question that you have to answer. Thank you, children. I hope you have understood whatever I have taught you in today's class. So you can review the answers.